And we're live. Welcome everyone that is watching this stream right now, and we already have more than 40 people waiting. We have 50 people, 50 likes already. Welcome. This stream is going to be about the geopolitical situation in Ukraine at the moment. Usually I don't talk too much about geopolitics, but I thought, something that is relevant to Orthodox Christianity, something that is relevant to what's going on in the Orthodox world today, I think it does need to be covered. Today with me, I have Conrad, a good friend of mine, who is willing to give out his takes, his analysis, because it is kind of his expertise, I will say. So he's here to give out his analysis, and we're going to be talking about, again, Ukraine and kind of how this started and where it might be going. So, Conrad, how about you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Conrad Franz. I write for turleytalks.com. I write about geopolitics, religious topics, domestic American politics, and yeah, I've been doing it for a few months now, and this is a beat, so pretty cool to come talk to David about it. He's a good buddy, so let's dive right on in. Let's get some analysis going.
Yeah. And I think, we can talk about what's going on with the war, who's doing good or whatever. But I think to kind of give context to what this whole thing is about, I think it's really good to start with the Euromaidan protest in 2014. That's how I personally got into politics at first, when I just kind of started reading, and I was interested in seeing, American sphere of influence, Russia's sphere, like, what are these terms, what are these ideas, what are these concepts? And it kind of just more and more, I started to become interested in politics personally. But I also remember that it was kind of the start of a lot of the deteriorating relationships between Russia and Ukraine, really with Russia and the Western world in general. So what really happened in the Euromaidan protests?
Well, the Euromaidan protests back in 2014, ultimately the big result was that Viktor Yanukovych was removed from office as the president of Ukraine. And he was noted for keeping Ukraine within the Russian sphere of influence. And obviously we know that in Western Ukraine, there's a higher percentage of those who very much assert Ukrainian identity and the Ukrainian language. But after the Euromaidan revolution, that faction came to basically dominate Ukrainian politics. And, eventually you got Petro Poroshenko in there, who was a raving Ukrainian nationalist. He was a huge supporter of what we now know as the schismatic Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And, some of the more undesirable characters that are represented in that faction. And ultimately, he became so unpopular that he got booted out. But the Euromaidan protests, that also, of course, led to the annexation of Crimea by Russia, which a lot of people are hearkening back to now because it was the most dramatic military action up until that point. And now it looks like this is not exactly a Crimea situation, because Crimea was pretty non-violent. Like, there was some lingering protest violence and Ukrainians protesting in the cities in Crimea, but as far as actual military violence, it was almost non-existent. So what we're seeing now is definitely an escalation from that. But yeah, you can't understand what's going on now without understanding what happened in 2014, because what we're definitely about to see is some form of attempt at regime change by the current Russians that are in Ukraine. And you can't understand that regime change without realizing that 2014 was a Western-backed regime change effort by NATO powers in the West to basically just take Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence and possibly ultimately get them into NATO.
Yeah, and some, in the normie sphere, right? A lot of people are they think the way Russia is acting is just kind of crazy. Why are they just, for no apparent reason, just entering into Ukraine right now? Why might that be? Well, kind of like the way I understand it is that Russia is concerned about NATO's sphere of influence. I mean, if you look at for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, America was very afraid that, so I believe Soviet missiles were like that close to their territory. And now think about it. If Ukraine, for example, joins NATO's sphere of influence instead of joining Russia's sphere of influence, there's going to be NATO troops on the border. And we need to also remember, this is one of the first things I learned about when looking into geopolitics, is that NATO really was formed as kind of like a anti-Russia military organization. Like it was kind of formed as an anti-Russia military defense organization, and over time it kind of became obsolete. But now it's transforming into something different from the way I understood. What would you say with this?
Yeah, well, I mean, Putin actually recently he revealed, like, I think a lot of people knew this already, but he revealed publicly, supposedly, for the first time, that Russia had asked to join NATO in 2000, and Bill Clinton, of course, refused. And I believe their justification was, we don't need a big country like Russia, which doesn't really make any sense if you're like a security organization. But when you realize that the entire purpose of the treaty organization was ultimately to contain, you can get Spenglerian about this, was ultimately to contain Russia and prevent any form, obviously, of Russian-German alliance forming, but also of just Russia itself become like the Soviet power before it, which was a multipolar world somewhat, depending on how much you think the Soviet Union was controlled. But ultimately, once the Soviet Union fell, we had a true unipolar world, and NATO was enacted to sustain that.
Yeah. So in terms of, like, if you're looking at this from the Russian perspective, then it becomes very clear how this is in fact can be understood to be defensive, right? And me personally, I'm not a Russophile. I don't think Conrad is either, but I think a lot of people, especially in Western media today, where there's a lot of propaganda going on, they kind of try to make Russia look like this warmonger nation, just itching for war. But what we are seeing instead is kind of just intelligent moves in order to secure itself, because you can't just say, oh well, we're not going to do anything about it as NATO comes right down to your door, but that's going to cause severe problems, especially if you're a global power. I mean, imagine if from the American perspective we had Chinese and Russian military troops and missiles in Mexico. I mean, Americans will be scared, right? So it's kind of like the opposite aspect to it, where American influence is still very much strong, especially in that area. And Russia is, and this is kind of what I've read from your article as well, is that Russia's main aim is to demilitarize Ukraine. And in fact, if you look at the strikes, the missile strikes that Russia did on Ukraine, the strikes are purely logistical, right? They hit the key military targets. They're not attacking, military base or anything like that. They're destroying the weapons. They're demilitarizing Ukraine in that manner. And the conclusion seems to be, the aim seems to be on that regard, as well as I think the Donbass region as well. So what would you say with regards to that as well?
Yeah, well, so obviously this invasion by Russia totally puts the Minsk agreements they're no longer relevant. And to those who don't know what that was like the diplomatic treaties and negotiation mechanism that existed to solve the situation between the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and the Ukrainian government. And of course, for the past 8 years, Russia has been clamoring to get back to Minsk to get back to the negotiating table there, because Ukraine has violated the ceasefire in the Donbass year after year after year. They're known for targeting civilians. They have militias that are known to explicitly target civilians, to terrorize the breakaway republics, because, I mean, it would make sense to demoralize that small population to eventually get them to rally around their leader, rejoin Ukraine, one of the biggest goals. But for Russia right now, obviously one of their casus belli for this operation was the onslaught of attacks on the DPR and the LPR. And of course, just a few days ago, Russia signed a recognition of those two breakaway states as independent countries. And so then once the Ukrainians fired on them, that went in violation of the treaties of friendship that they signed with those small breakaway states. And so that gives them a casus belli for it being, of course, defensive. And of course, I think a lot of us who have been moderate or reasonable on this and been against the bellicose rhetoric of America are a bit surprised at the level that Russia took it to. I think a lot of us were perhaps expecting a quick annexation of Donetsk and Luhansk, and like maybe even getting into Kharkiv and some of these other places that are closer into eastern Ukraine. But mobilization from Crimea, from Belarus, actually landing troops in Kiev, that was a bit surprising. And I think ultimately, and the other thing I was going to say is part of this is a show of force on the part of Russia, because their precision, logistical, military-focused airstrikes occurred very simultaneously across the entire nation of Ukraine, Western Ukraine as well, Eastern Ukraine, Southern Ukraine, areas outside of Kiev. And that was undoubtedly a display of Russia's ability to mobilize logistics to strike targets across a vast landscape. Ukraine is not a small country. And so them showing their ability to do that definitely was, I think on April 21st of this year, Putin made the remarks that incursions on Donetsk and Luhansk would be met with asymmetrical force. And that was in response to some other negotiations about Ukraine's NATO status. And I think we're finally seeing that asymmetrical response right now.
Yeah, I definitely think so as well. So I believe that we could talk about what's happening. Well, we could talk about actually the Western response to this, because this is kind of what was really funny to me, is seeing how, how is America going to react to this? How are how is UK, how is Europe going to react to this? And the reaction so far has been very weak from their side, and it clearly shows that they're not really. It seems like they weren't even really prepared for this, because when the offensive started, America just said, give us a couple minutes. We got to go to sleep. I mean, that's basically what they said in diplomatic language. We just got to go to sleep. So obviously they weren't prepared, or it seems like they wanted this to happen, or they just, saw that this could happen. They just had nothing to do against it. They just didn't have any idea how they could react to it, because usually if you have a plan, you execute immediately, and you look for different scenarios. So what could Russia do? Russia could wait. Russia could just stay at the border and play defense. Russia could do what they did. But, you plan each scenario accordingly, and whatever happens, execute instantly. That, what is executed by the West has been nothing. It's just radio silence. So that to me kind of was very interesting to see, and it seems like that's going to go on. And most we're going to see is just more sanctions. But why wouldn't that, for example, matter? Why does it matter that it's just sanctions and nothing else?
Yeah, the Western response, I think I still hold my position that this whole thing has been the U.S. fomenting conflict that didn't necessarily have to get violent. And a lot of people who hold that opinion, like me, are like, people are like, wow, how can you hold this opinion still? Russia just rolled in with this asymmetrical response, strategic strikes, all this stuff. And I think you need to recognize that over the 8 years of this, negotiation around this issue, there've been a lot of back and forth on both sides. And a few days, like the day before this happened, it was basically confirmed that, after the recognition of the DPR and the LPR, Germany and America froze Nord Stream 2, which is the pipeline from Russia into Germany. And once Russia saw that piece of negotiating mechanics was off the table, and they saw that there was no reason to not take all of the pie that they could and use the most strategic methods and the most effective methods to foment the change of regime in Ukraine, because now that they saw that the other side was totally willing to surrender Germany to a cold winter of no gas and high gas prices. But ultimately, the sanctions, Putin has been saying that the sanctions aren't really going to work for a while now. There's talks from the more, like the UK in particular, who have been the most hawkish on this issue entirely, and more than Americans. They really want to remove Russia from SWIFT, which is the international financial banking connectivity service that allows really easy, transnational trade and money wiring and whatnot. And they really want to remove it. Italy and Germany are like not really willing to do that. They're being pressured right now. And short of that, which Russia still claims it would be able to be resilient against, China has actually condemned the sanctions. So the fact that Russia will still be open to Chinese markets. They have a treaty with Azerbaijan. They have good relations with some of their other, not all, but some of their other Caucasus neighbors. So the fact that they have that tight relationship and clearly have discussed this plan with Chinese leadership is going to be one of the big saving graces for them if, the mother of all sanctions, as that's being said in Washington, really comes out. And ultimately, that's very scary for the U.S. I talk about this in my article. It's titled, Neoliberal World has Fallen. And the fact that the U.S. has no more diplomatic, economic clout to truly manipulate these what they consider lesser powers shows that multipolarity is definitely here to stay.
Yeah, and this was kind of one of your themes in your latest article, I believe. It's kind of like the current world order falling. And what is the current world order characterized by? Well, you can even listen it to in their speech. I think one of the arguments they made about like getting closer to Russia is that, oh well, we're harmless. We're just bringing democracy, right? But democracy here is just a buzzword, as you said in your article as well. It's just a buzzword for a lot of the secularism, a lot of these kind of beliefs in the West that is very popular today, that has destroyed man's soul completely over the years. And that's what they want to bring. They try to bring that to the Middle East. In Turkey, that has already been, they brought that already. I mean, Turkish politics is kind of being transformed in that regard, but Middle Eastern politics is also being transformed in that regard, with relation to Lebanon, for instance, where there's an exportation of Western values into the rest of the world. And so if the rest of the world adopts Western values, then it will be easier to subjugate them according to these values. And it's really it's like spreading a new religion. The religion of Americanism is really being spread here. But what then can we say is the kind of alternative or the opposing viewpoint that Russia or maybe even China brings to the table then? That's kind of what I'm interested in hearing right now is, we know about the Western worldview, but what does Russia and China offer? Because a lot of people say, well, Russia and China actually don't offer anything better. Is that the case? Or, what is it that they offer?
That's a good segue here. I think you can never look at it as, the good guys versus the bad guys. We don't live in a comic book. So this idea that perhaps preferring one system and one half of a multipolar world to maybe gain more prominence and gain more relevance over another isn't, a wholesale endorsement of those regimes or those systems. However, China and Russia are notably illiberal. Both those leaders, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, enjoy relatively high approval ratings among their people, at least compared to a lot of Western democratic leaders, and they're able to execute quickly. They're able to plan long term because of the longer reigns, you could say, that they have, as opposed to 4-year, 5-year terms in these Western governments. And ultimately, I kind of refer to it in my article as a return to civilizational states. Like we'll have instead of the post-war the nation states that are entirely subjugated to international organizations, world orders, which ultimately all head back to America, UK, the Atlanticist powers. They, with nation states controlled to these supranational groups, we're referring more to where the power ultimately rests in these individual civilizational kind of proto or post empires, such as China, such as Russia, such as Germany, still totally neutered, but you still have the vestiges of the British Empire, but most of that power now, of course, lies with the globalist American empire. And with Russia in this situation, they've proven that they can mobilize. They've proven that there is still, you could call it a future for a civilizational state that isn't willing to entirely compromise to neoliberal democracy, that still has a very close relationship with its church, that funds it, that doesn't promote the idea of religious freedom at all costs. There is a preferred state religion within these countries. In China, of course, that's basically communism, and they have some Confucianist rivals going on. But ultimately, these are, and look, like, here's another example. Like, what Russia does in Georgia is not, I understand Georgian resistance to Russia. Like, I understand that they're a Orthodox state, they're a Christian state as well, with a real legacy of a kingdom, and they have their own language, they're their own group. But just because Russia overstepped some of their boundaries and their sphere of influence and attempts to definitely do more than they need to with gaining influence over Georgia, doesn't mean that they should then fully embrace the other side, because we see in Georgia now, they have pride parades every year foisted upon them, no matter how much the Georgian people don't want it. They have a bunch of NGOs that monopolize their election cycles, even though there are candidates that embody Georgian values that under normal circumstances would easily win a Georgian election. And we're seeing right now as the Russia-China alliance forms, and then that the US, we could say, definitely is in a state of decline. It's that alternative is going to become more more clear to perhaps dissidents in America, dissidents in the West. And there's been a lot of talk about if Russia and China can secure more powers, they're going to be are we going to see some of the games that we played with them on their border perhaps played on us in our border by them? Think of Venezuela, think of Cuba, think of, Spain and France, they're separatist groups. Think about those kinds of groups that could be exploited by a growing civilizational bloc that is opposed to the entire, both the base ethics and, of course, the institutions of their enemies in the West.
Yeah, it seems like especially the Western approach is to exploit dialectics, right? So, for example, in the Ukraine, in the West, if you're an anti-fascist, that means you're leftist, right? In the East, if you're anti-fascist, that means you're right-wing, because anti-fascism will, for example, in the Russian context, will refer to their opposition to Azov, which, by the way, although they're supposedly right-wing, they're being funded by their ideological enemies, which shows you how much they're actually consistent with their beliefs. You're an Azov battalion and all of these different groups in Ukraine. So there's kind of like this completely different approach that a lot of Western people don't understand, because, as you said, we kind of like to see things as, good guys versus the bad guys. And I think a lot of the Russophiles, for example, they don't really understand that. And there's a good reason why you can like Russia. It has history. It is history as an Orthodox Christian nation, and especially seems like Putin is not opposed to this history. And there's the government supports it, but the Russian government still also stands for things that Christianity is opposed to, or like it allows things that it's opposed to. Abortion is one of the examples, for example, along with many other things, and they still cooperate with these globalist groups as well, right? But it is less of a good guys versus bad guys, and more like one group versus one group. And you talked about multipolar, the multipolar world. I think that is what a lot of people want these days, right? They want to be in a state where neither positions have total control, neither groups have total control over the world, and that rather there is some kind of like a conflict, so that maybe throughout this conflict there might be something better coming out of it. It sounded a lot like Hegelian, synthesis stuff, but in terms of like, actual real world application, that is, I think a lot of people are hoping for that. So hoping for something like that, right? So again, you get the example of Georgia, right? If Georgia became like pro-Russia, that will be strange, because, it's not in their interest. But if Georgia then became pro-West, well, that will also be just as strange, because the West has nothing good to offer, right? Georgia should be Georgia. It should define its own, history. So define its own direction. And it's one of the countries, for example, that I think it will be good if they kind of try to, balance the two opposite forces instead of kind of just like playing with one or the other. And I think even Russia wouldn't fully mind if Georgia just had an opposition to West, even if Georgia also kind of said, we're going to look at our own, we're going to be looking at our own destiny here. So it seems to me then, by what you said, that what China and Russia are offering is just kind of illiberalism, a kind of like an opposition to liberalism, kind of more of a dependence on a collective power of the state, something like that. You can also say, in the West, for example, we can sometimes enjoy, what freedom brings to us. But in the case of Russia, they're not tolerant of, for example, Aryans, right? We're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that. It's good that they're not tolerant, but there's also a deeper problem within it, because a lot of these, missionary groups that are not allowed in Russia, well, they're not allowed because these people usually are spies. And we see this in, I think there was a FBI document or a CIA document that said that one of the most popular methods of spying people were the missionaries. So America is still spying on, they still try to infiltrate and spy on Russia. But to get back, and I'm going to close my finishing thoughts, but to get back on the war and what's happening in the present moment, what do you think Russia wants, right? Do you think they want this war to go for a long time? Do you think they want to just finish this as soon as possible? What do you think Russia wants with this war, or with this, crisis or happening or whatever?
Ultimately, Western media is going to paint this as Putin has been planning this exact situation for years and that it's part of a broader plan to restore the Soviet Union or something. And I don't think that's true. And before we move on from the China, Russia, illiberal situation, I by no means think that, I think a lot of even normies have been talking about this, how our biggest mistake was isolating Russia and then opening up to China simultaneously. And what that reveals is that, according to a lot of these people, at least, like, driving Russia into the arms of China wasn't exactly necessary. And if America wasn't so married to like pure secular neoliberalism, they might have been open to being friends with rising, post-Soviet Russia. But unfortunately, I think the civilizational differences were ultimately too much. I think there are powers that be within our apparatus that have fundamental hatred of Orthodox Christianity and Russia. And because of that, they got driven into that realm. And I think there's even a chance that it will lead ultimately to a rise of China and an ultimate military confrontation with China in the West. That, like, I'm not saying that would be good. I'm not saying that China taking total dominion over Central Asia or parts of the Middle East or Africa is necessarily good. I think Chinese style social credit system is not how Western people are really meant to organize or live, but that's almost irrelevant to the actual situation at hand on whether or not that's going to happen, whether or not I think it's good or bad. But Russia and what they want, I think Russia is a lot more reactive than people think. Like, I think Putin ultimately I think there's a lot of support in Russia for a form of pan-Slavism, where they do feel that the collapse of the Soviet Union had they would consider their countrymen ripped away from them. But I don't think Putin really has this fantasy of Estonian erasure, Finnish erasure. Like, I think there are certain forms of Ukrainian nationalism, and he even said in one of his speeches that he views Ukraine as an exception to some of the other former republics, that there's really no reason that they should have such a strong anti-Russian identity, that if they are to be independent, if they are to be their own state, it needs to still be completely within the Russian sphere of influence. And I think it's important to also recognize that the splitting of Ukraine and Russia very much mirrors the splitting of Serbia and Kosovo, which both of these split off states from their original larger homelands are the religious centers of those people, of those civilizations. And there is a form of humiliation ritual, I think, that comes with the splitting of these Christian former empires into these states that breed perpetual conflict and resentment even from the international community. But Russia, ultimately, this response came after being really, really pushed for 8 years, I think by being gaslit in a lot of ways and trying to resort to diplomacy. But in the end, they realized that sometimes the stick is the only thing that people listen to, and they did this asymmetric response. And I don't think we're going to see any kind of, like I said this in my article, I don't think we're even going to see a long-term occupation of even central Ukraine. I think ultimately military power will be consolidated in the east. I think Donetsk and Luhansk will be entirely put under the control of the DPR and the LPR authorities. There's going to be a lot of demilitarization and perhaps ultimately some treaties signed about military presence in the eastern part of Ukraine. But I don't think it's, like Putin said, that it's not going to be a long occupation. Of course, that could be a bluff. That could be a way to buy time. But I don't see a full-on occupation of the entire country happening at all.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think it will be very silly of Putin to just try to take like the rest of Ukraine. Even aside from the logistical problems, it's going to make you diplomatically look horrible, right? Because why are they, what is their reason for getting into this? Well, it's because of Donbass, right? And if they take more than that, or if they, change things more than that, then I think it's completely justified that people will indeed start thinking, they're overstepping their boundaries. What is going on over here, right? So I think it makes sense that actually Russia doesn't, some people, they're sensationalists and they think that, Russia's going to take over Ukraine completely. That will not be a smart thing for them to do, all right? I mean, that's not what they, people can stomach Donbass, but they can't stomach the entirety of Ukraine being taken. And it's going to be hard to administrate it. It's going to be hard to diplomatically justify yourself for doing it. And, you're kind of forcing yourself to be closer to NATO too, which is Russia doesn't want that. Russia wants to stay as far away from them as possible. You don't want to get closer to your enemies unless you're ready for a total war, which is a completely different scenario, right? But, Russia, I don't think they're up for a total war. And one thing that's interesting, if you analyze financial markets, is that for 3-4 months, not only the stock market, not only cryptos, everything has been kind of going on a downtrend, right? Everything's been going down. Even gold and silver, although recently they're going up, but everything was going down as if they were kind of prepared for this to happen, as if people were kind of saying, okay, ready, give us a couple months, let's exit the markets and crush these, shrimps, and then we can go back in when the whole thing is settled and done. And this is kind of like a classic thing that happens all the time. It happened with the meme virus, the March declaration, when people were like, oh no, buy toilet paper, right? These elites were kind of getting rid of. So one thing I've noticed personally is that a lot of these things are planned and the big boys are in on it like months before. It's not something that just happens instantly. These things take time. And so we're kind of seeing the culmination, and that's very important to bear in mind, because this is not kind of like an emotional response or anything. This was definitely planned. I mean, the way Russia is kind of executing its military strategies, that's definitely planned. And it, I think, kind of shows the two very different views. Russia is kind of showing how a superpower actually handles things, like military superpower, because it's kind of doing things quickly. And you said about they don't want this to drag out. I think another reason they don't want to drag this out is because if this gets dragged out, a Russian economic crisis will clearly happen. Clearly happen. They don't want that. But if they also waited for a long time, that will mean that Ukraine will just get mobilized more and more and more. So right now was really the best time to hit them, because clearly Ukraine wasn't ready. If they were ready, they won't lose their military infrastructure in 4 hours. They won't. They lost their entire military infrastructure nearly, if you are to trust Russian reports. But even Ukrainian reports seem to kind of like suggest that, right? And so kind of, I guess we kind of exhausted a lot of the other things. Do you have anything other to add before we move on to the more religious aspect to it, or should we just kind of move on to that? What would you say?
I've got one or two more comments. One of the things I want to say is one of the best pieces of evidence to the lack of, I guess you could call, imperialist ambition that Russia currently has is the political will within the Donbass has always been around rejoining the Russian Federation. Like, you can read any public statements of the governments there. The goal has always been incorporation and entirely joining Russia. And the reason that Russia didn't do that for 8 years is because, and I think this is almost to the shame of the Russian Federation, is they much rather would have wanted, they really wanted to use the DPR and the LPR as, as negotiating tactics on the table of fomenting regime change and bringing back a pro-Russia president into Ukraine. I think they were very much willing to completely cede those republics back to the Ukrainian central government if they could have had a more Yanukovych-like president put back in. And the only reason I think they recognize their independence, and ultimately I think they are going to integrate them into Russia, is because they were completely out of options and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was frozen. And I think that really shows, like, people are excited. People have been Givi posting a lot about the some of the nationalists in Donbass who have died, and how they what they wanted has happened, and so they can smile down, I guess. But it's not because, we have to be honest, it's not entirely because of some brotherly love for those people. The Russians made sure that they did this when it was the only political option for them. And that's not to say that there isn't some genuine support and looking out for their ethnic and linguistic brothers, but it is still very political. And I was going to say one other thing about...
While you're thinking about that, we got a £10 donation, British pounds, by e-book reviews. Thank you. And let us all pray for a peaceful resolution. Indeed. And I forgot to mention, but you can also, if you want to support both me and Conrad for this stream, then because it's going to be half and half, then you can do so via super chats. So did you recollect what you were thinking about, or?
Not really, but the
Mhm.
um, no, it's right on the tip of my tongue actually. But no, we can go on to the more
Yeah, yeah,
religious
yeah,
stuff. Got a lot to say
yeah.
about that as well.
Sure, sure. But I think before we get into kind of like the religious aspect to it, I think, yeah, this kind of is a good segue because what we really desire, we can, quote Orthodox representatives, that is the bishops on this topic. What do they say about the war, right? Well, you can kind of guess that they're not going to say anything hawkish because it, especially, Metropolitan Onufri, who is in Ukraine, obviously is not going to say anything hawkish. That will be diplomatically astute. But at the same time, there is a real sentiment amongst Orthodox hierarchy, even from the Moscow side, that this is indeed something wrong. In fact, Metropolitan Onufri, who is under the, ultimately under the Moscow Patriarchate, said that this war, in fact, is a repetition of the sin of Cain. It is a brotherly war being a brother attacking another brother. And so it's a form of fratricide, is according to kind of his understanding. And there is a quote, I believe in 2017, from Metropolitan Hilarion of Moscow in regards to kind of like the comments of war or how we should look at war. And he said, we should never be hawkish. We should never look at war as if it's something good or if it's something desirable. So it should always be looked at, avoided, and those who are hawkish, in fact, he says they commit blasphemy. So he has very strong statements on it. So I think it's quite fair to say that war is never something that we desire. I mean, if you look at Orthodox canons, especially the soldiers are, within the guidance of the bishop, usually according to the canons, there's a 3-year period which they don't commune, right? And it's not because the soldiers committed they did kind of surround themselves with sin because it's death, right? War is kind of the manifestation of death in a lot of places. Which, by the way, this war, there's not that many deaths, right, compared to other conflicts. But that's an aside. But it is for the soul of that soldier, for example, that he kind of needs healing, right? So there is that moral aspect to it, and this is kind of why, although we can talk about the geopolitical moves and aspects to it, that should always be remembered, is that wars, killings, etc. is not something that we should celebrate. It's not something that we should kind of say, oh yeah, good thing. But it's always a tragedy, even if it's for a good cause. And that's kind of like the moral aspects on the comments. Do you have any other comments or?
Yeah, I could say something. I think at this point, like, yeah, there's absolutely no reason that, like, if this could have been solved diplomatically or even with a even less invasive military measure, it would have been very much desirable. But I do think, everyone calling for, that this is fratricidal, which it is. This is brothers fighting brothers. That was happening to the people of Donetsk and Luhansk. They were living under a, not even worse than an occupation. They were living under like perpetual fear of strikes. And if this conflict will end quickly and lead an end to that, there is something to rejoice over, because there would be, broadly speaking, a cycle of violence that was broken. But of course, this level of attack, there will be civilian casualties. We're seeing reports now that Zelensky is calling for total civilian mobilization and drafts, and that could lead to a lot of tragic things happening. And at this point, it sounds easy to say, if well, the people that you support in this broader conflict are in this upper hand, so now you support surrender for the lack of bloodshed. Well, I understand the criticisms that could come from that, but at this point, I think it would just be a lot better for the Ukrainian regime to step down and for a less NATO-aligned president ultimately come into power, because, again, I don't really think the current regime is particularly legitimate there either. And I understand that a lot of people are going to have a problem with that, and I don't necessarily condemn someone for their lack of desire of Russian influence in their country. But I also think that Metropolitan Onufri, has been the stance of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They support the independent Ukrainian state. I don't see any reason for him to alienate his flock or or anything like that. I think his statement is perfectly understandable and respectable as a peacekeeper in his country.
Yeah, let us not also forget Saint Nicholas of Japan, when he was corresponding with the Orthodox Christians in Japan. There was a question regarding, we're in a war with Russia. Russia is an Orthodox nation. You come from there. But it's our nation too. What should we do? Who should we pray for? And St. Nicholas said, you should pray for Japan because that's your country. So, patriotism in that regard, if a Ukrainian person is patriotic about their country, then, they can pray for their country, right? And that's something and they can, support their country. If they want to, they can fight for their country. Although, in my personal opinion, I think we're beyond the age of like becoming soldiers. I think becoming soldiers kind of, is an obsolete thing. I think you kind of become a foot soldier for really geopolitical interests rather than the interests of your nation, which is not a good thing. But, if you want to do, they're not morally, in fact, they are, these are virtuous things. These are virtuous feelings. But at the same time, what you noted is important because, my kind of comments weren't about Russia at all, in fact. I think my comments was kind of just the situation itself because ever since the Euromaidan protests, really, in the Donbass region, the Russians have been persecuted. That's undeniable. And, people have forgotten this because we don't have proper countries anymore. But the normal thing for a country, if its people is getting persecuted in another country, the normal response is to kind of just go to that country, knock its door and say, hey, what's going on? And if they disrespect you, you say, all right, I'm going to show you what we can do. And then you just show them who's boss. That's kind of like the normal response. And people have forgotten that. People don't think that way anymore because again, it's the Western mode of thinking. And this is kind of why America is kind of transporting democracy, right? Fake democracy, is that this is the kind of thinking that ferments so that if all different nations think this way, then no one is going to have any problem with America completely controlling them. So democracy has become weaponized, not only against its own people, because it controls the people in that country, but it also controls other countries. But to get back on the religious aspect and kind of this, I also want to talk about, the schismatics in Ukraine. There's the Orthodox, the actual canonical church, which is headed by Metropolitan Onufri. And then there is the schismatic group, which is unfortunately recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Alexandria. Now, why were they recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate? Well, we need to understand that the Ecumenical Patriarchate is in Turkey. And the Turkish government does indeed, this is the case, for example, only the Ecumenical Patriarchate can catechize people in Turkey. So there was someone, apparently, I found this out yesterday, someone that wants to be a Christian in Antioch was going to be catechized in an Antiochian Orthodox church. The priest said, you can't. Why? Because you can only be catechized in the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Is that because the Ecumenical Patriarchate wants to, force things? No. In fact, it's because of the kind of relationships between the Turkish government and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. There's a Halki seminary in modern-day Turkey. It is not opened, right? And the Turkish government is not opening it. They cite, it's because of kind of like the changes of education. You need to be in the Turkish curriculum. And Patriarchate said, we can be in the curriculum. We don't have any problem. And they're still not opening it. They were nearly going to destroy the seminary, in fact. It's still not open. So there is that pressure from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So where are they going to look? They could look at Russia. Unfortunately, they're not doing that. They're looking at America. And, Patriarch Bartholomew is very, close with Joe Biden. And so he's kind of on that side of this conflict. And so the kind of the geopolitical aspect of entering into Ukraine with the schismatics has that aspect to it, with the Ecumenical Patriarchate trying to spread its sphere of influence so that America can have influence over Ukraine. So, but the Russian side, very interestingly, has claimed that in fact it is America that is doing these things. It's not really the Ecumenical Patriarchate that's encroaching on Ukraine and encroaching on Russian territory. The EP is merely following the United States. And that's kind of the comment that they make. And so we also need to think of it in this manner. And with the recent happenings, the schism, I think it does have geopolitical significance. And it also has it factors into Russian thinking, what is going on here? Because the schismatic church really represents American power, right? And American power in religious politics, I can tell you, that's the easiest way to get into American sphere of influence. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think the schismatics in Ukraine they represent the worst of Ukrainian subversion towards the NATO and U.S. sphere of influence. Epiphany Dymenko is not even a properly ordained priest, and the ecumenical patriarchate is ultimately recognizes that it's subservient to the Turkish government. It has no way to expand within its own geographical region. So because of that, they have such a tight relationship with Alexandria, who they named the Patriarch of all Africa, which technically is a bit of an anachronistic term. And then they're expanding into Ukraine as they knew that there was a separation. There's autonomy among the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and then there's even plans among the Canonical Church to perhaps eventually reach some sort of autocephaly. But they exploited that difference and divided the country. And when it comes to some of these more the religious aspects of the whole struggle, there is like this whole sort of, we talked about the fall of the secular order and the rise of an illiberal and ultimately more religious order, and how throughout history it's understood that if people of your ethnicity, people of your language group, of your nation are being oppressed across the border of another empire or country, you knock on the door and see what's up. And that's very common in the Russian mind. Like the Russians understand that, Serbians understand that, a lot of Muslim nations understand that. But to the American mind and the secular Western mind, they hear that rhetoric perhaps from Putin giving a speech to his people, and they're like, this is just evil. This is disgusting nationalism, rhetoric, propaganda that I would never fall for, blah, 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 race, ethnicity doesn't matter. And no, the world is returning back to truth in a certain form in that regard. And that is more important, is going to drive more people to, support a nationalist revival of their nation as opposed to some nebulous idea like democracy or spreading human rights or anything like that. And that's ultimately like the Ukrainian or the OCU, the schismatics, they fall for that trap, even though a lot of their followers and the most ardent supporters are hard right wingers. They're, neo-Nazis, they're Azov people, right sector. They still openly say like, yeah, we're going to soften on homosexuality because of our opposition to Russia. Like they say the quiet part out loud. And that is ultimately one of the biggest pieces of evidence that it's not a genuine, religious revival for independence from an outside power. It's an attempt to divide the true church.
Yeah, and someone made a very, very, very stupid comment. It is deleted in the lecture, but someone claimed that no, Russians create cultural Marxism to destroy the Catholic Church. So the Fatima people and all these people coming up with their. We gotta understand that. First of all, that's total nonsense. Second of all, all of your favorite Roman Catholic bishops like Fulton Sheen, guess what? He collaborated with the CIA. Okay, he collaborated with the CIA. That's the real KGB stuff, right? People will talk about, oh, Putin was KGB, or this bishop was KGB, or all this. First of all, if you wanted to work for the government in Russia, you had to be KGB, right? I mean, that's kind of like just how it worked. But in America, that's different, right? That is a different thing. You don't have to be CIA to work for the government in America. At no point. And if you're a bishop, you don't have to be CIA. And so all of these kind of like based bishops that create this dialectic, right, of what we have today, the conservative versus cultural Marxist dialectic. And it is, in fact, in some forms, a false dialectic, and both views, both conservatives and Marxists, in fact, had the same exact presuppositions. But in Russia, it's not this case, right? When you had different groups in Russia, those are genuinely different groups. But in America, the conservatives and cultural Marxists are on the same team. And you're seeing this in, for example, you can say, oh, well, they don't agree with, policy in the country. Well, geopolitically, they agree with nearly everything. Seems like the only ones that don't agree with them really are the, I suppose, Trump people. I suppose, like Trump was the only president that had a war-free administration in the last 40 years in America. I consider that very significant. War-free administration in America, that's significant. But to kind of get back into the Orthodox Church in Russia, Ukraine, etc., it is indeed the case, that there's canonical irregularities. And what makes this even more confusing is that the Ecumenical Patriarchate does indeed have a sound argument, canonically speaking. But a lot of people, they'll focus on the canonical aspects to it, especially, etc. But, Archbishop Anastasios of Albania, who is under, the Greek Church, I believe, the Albanian Church, he says that, yes, they had canonical powers to do what they did. So what they did is not an uncanonical thing in that sense, but it's a very bad move, right? And he kind of questions, why did they do such a thing? And he's Archbishop Anastasius wants us to think of this in a geopolitical manner. He's saying this is not a religious, this action was not religious, right? There's a geopolitical undertone to it. It is really America moving these things, right? And so we talk about America, NATO sphere, and the West is kind of like playing dumb, right? Oh, we're not doing anything. You're just relaxing. But the schismatics in Ukraine is just another aspect of American sphere of influence moving into Ukraine, and Russia again sees that. But most people today, they don't see that, because most people today don't even know of Orthodox Christianity, whereas Russia is very clearly conscious of that identity, even though again it has, for example, church retention problems, etc. Even the ones that don't go to church still has some kind of that feeling of identity, right? And it guides their politics. And most people in the West, they don't see this. They don't realize this. Especially us as Orthodox Christians, we can clearly see this, right? But people kind of don't see the geopolitical aspect to it. And there's also, if you don't have any other comments in regards to this aspect, we can kind of move to the juicy stuff, or I kind of been saving for the prophecy stuff, right? Because that usually gets the clicks, that usually gets the attention. But I think you have.
I got one thing to say about that, and then we'll dive right into some of the stuff this guy had to say. But the as far as the canonical prerogatives of Constantinople, there is some canonical basis for an idea that they could have granted autocephaly with appeal to this group. The fact that they were, non-ordained schismatics, of course, renders the whole thing dead in the water. But even more than that, there are some takes from canonists and smart bishops. I recommend everyone read Metropolitan Nikiforos of Cyprus, his the solution to the problem in Ukraine according to the canons of the Orthodox Church. He gives a good canonical breakdown with the history of the church, with how it relates to how Cyprus gains autocephaly and all those sorts of things, and how Constantinople actually violated all sorts of canonical prerogatives. But to then use this kind of as a segue into some of the juicier stuff, we do need some form of pan-Orthodox council. There needs to be some form of impetus to meet and solve a lot of these jurisdictional issues. Elder Ephraim did make statements that something like this would happen, even though a lot of Orthodox people see no way that a pan-Orthodox council could happen in today's environment, and I kind of sympathize with that. I don't quite see a roadmap, but we can pray that the words of Elder Ephraim would come true in that regard. But regarding some of the prophecies in this whole realm, I think a lot of people, when they hear prophecies about current events and war, they get really scared. They're like, oh, what are you, like a Protestant, millenarian, end times person that's going to tell me all these sorts of predictions with exact dates that aren't going to come true? And that kind of stuff obviously has no place in the Orthodox tradition. I'm just a layman. I'm not gonna prophesy. I'm not going to tell anybody what they do or don't have to believe. But we do have the words of our saints on a lot of this modern stuff. We have their disciples that speak out on this stuff. And in his spiritual counsels in Volume 2, Spiritual Awakening, St. Paisios, of course, does talk about the Third World War and ultimately how that conflict will revolve around a conflict between Russia and Turkey. And now people are like, well, this is Russia and Ukraine. What does that have to do with anything? Well, Russia has taken control of almost the entire Bosphorus, of the entire Black Sea coast of Ukraine. And of course, the other Black Sea power, Turkey, is going to notice that. And Ukraine has asked that Turkey close the Bosphorus Straits, and the Dardanelles is the other strait, close those to Russian ships. And Turkey, I don't think they've immediately responded yes or no to that, but they have condemned the actions in Ukraine. And Elder Joseph of Vatopedi, I'm traveling, so I don't have my books with me, but I found it was him who made statements about Russian action in the Bosphorus and how the closing of the straits ultimately a sign of worse tribulations and warfare stuff to come. And again, this ultimately does result in the liberation of Constantinople by the Russians, a lot of battles and whatnot, but it will ultimately lead to the Christianization of Constantinople and the Turkish state. And a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh, so you're just buying into stuff about how the base Russian perfect Christian empire is going to come in and liberate this nationalist fantasy of retake Constantinople. Like, what are you, like a trad-calf crusader larper? And it's like, no, like this is very much in line with the tradition of Christianity. I mean, there's nowhere in the Bible are the virtues of Babylon extolled, but still they are brought down upon the unbelieving and the sinful Israelites, who are still God's chosen people, are brought down upon them as a scourge and as a punishment and as a way to move forward the Jewish people, the Israelis, Israel, the nation of Israel, and then ultimately the church. The church comes out of that, of course. And we see now, I talked again about how there's some of these more civilizational, traditional ideas of, solidarity with one ethnic group and an insistence on the forwardness and the perpetuation of a state religion. And this idea of listening to one's holy elders and listening to the words of the last generation's prophets and the saints, that is a part of, I guess I could call it the epistemological reawakening of tradition. And, we had a lot of analysts throughout the 20th century that predicted all sorts of things, the end of history, the triumph of neoliberal globalism, the triumph of the free market, and the free flow of money as a way to solve all the world's problems, which, when you think about it from a Christian perspective, is, of course, utopian satanic nonsense. And now, as we begin to enter into a more post-secular future, consulting the words of ascetics, elders, prophets, that is something that I think makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and to kind of track back to the Fulton Sheen stuff, in Wemhau's book, I posted this in live chat. It's and this is a traditional Roman Catholic, by the way. There's a chat calf saying that Fulton Sheen was an FBI informant who was spreading Americanist liberalism. And why is this important? Well, we need to understand that in the religious sphere, Americanism can spread into the Orthodox Church as well. They did that in Catholicism, where Americanist liberalism is manifesting it in the form of ecumenism, in the case of Roman Catholics. Now, even the traditionalist Roman Catholics are totally ecumenist. How could this happen? Well, it's because of the higher class, right, of the church in America completely adopted Americanist liberalism, and the danger is still the same with the Orthodox Church. Now, it's different, and this is kind of worrying aspect, is that this might be used as a reason to persecute Orthodox Christians in America, right? I can tell you very clearly, and I'm not saying this like sensation, I'm saying this so that you can pray for them and also even support them if you can. Jordanville is being pressured in this regard by America. All right, they have been for a long time, and especially with this, I can tell you they can be pressured. When I was in Arizona, in the United States, you know what happened? You know what happened one day? An Archon, I was in the Greek Orthodox Church. This was a church I was baptized in. An Archon gave a speech, and this speech was completely anti-Russia. We need to destroy Russia kind of stuff. And people were like looking at each other, it's like, what did this guy just say? He's talking about destroying Russia. He's talking about, how America's great and Russia is evil and all this kind of stuff. We have a Russian church near us, and this guy is saying this kind of stuff. What is going on? Because of Americanist infiltration, right? If they have religious control over its people, this is one aspect to it, and Orthodoxy does provide that refuge, that freedom today in America, still to this day, from Americanist establishments. And this is something that Russia has in mind. It's something Ukraine has in mind even. And by the way, to kind of get back on the super chat, we got a 10 British pound super chat by Eugen, who says, how will Constantinople treat the OCU going forward, seeing as Putin will likely ban them from Ukraine and Fener controls all their parishes in the diaspora? They'll basically lose all the churches. Well, they would if... I don't think that's going to happen, because that will necessitate Russia taking over the entirety of Ukraine. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think the OCU is going to have less of a power. What do you think about this? Do you think that's fair to say, or...?
Well, I think Patriarch Kirill did make some comments, it was 4 months ago, that he said something to the tune of, soon the schismatics will no longer exist or no longer be a problem. And I don't think there will be any kind of occupation that would forcibly reduce the OCU's population or seize their parishes or anything like that. I just think that if there is regime change, that regime is obviously going to go back to supporting the canonical church under Metropolitan Onufri, stop any kind of state funding of the OCU. There are all sorts of property disputes in Ukrainian court between schismatic and canonical parishes that I'm sure a pro-Russian regime would, put their finger on the scale for the canonical church. And no, I think that's
Yeah.
I think the problem, there might be a flare up in the problem because, I mean, who knows what Constantinople is going to say. Like, there's been a lot of bishops releasing statements. Like, I'm sure Bartholomew has a doozy written up. But ultimately, I think this will probably lead to a future where the schismatics ultimately are no longer a problem.
Yeah, definitely. And hopefully that is indeed the case, because a lot of people kind of think, oh, it's the Orthodox having a problem. First of all, the problems we're facing, they're really foundationally from the outside, from our enemies. They're not being constructed from within. Like, it's not as if we have a pope that is collaborating with these groups like a certain other religion has. In fact, these are outside forces trying to get themselves in. And this is kind of like the beauty of Orthodoxy, is its decentralized structure, is that you can, for example, you can have force, or you can have some form of influence over one patriarchate, but that doesn't mean you have influence over the other patriarchates instantly, right? And that's kind of like the decentralized aspect of Orthodoxy that really keeps it strong against outside influences. Because even, by the way, even in EP parishes, I don't actually want to say, but even amongst EP parishes, there are people that don't necessarily support what Patriarch Bartholomew is doing with Ukraine, right? How is that possible? I thought this guy was your pope. Well, he's not our pope, right? We still follow the canons. We still have discernment that we can use. But to get back on the prophecy, one of the things that you noted is that the Bosphorus was, I think Russia told Turkey to close the Bosphorus or something like that. What was it?
Ukraine asked Turkey to close it to not allow Russian ships and trade to pass through.
Yeah, Ukraine. And was that an aspect of Saint Paisios' statements? And actually, before I move on, yeah,
I believe it might be a problem. I don't have my spiritual awakening book with you right now, but Elder Joseph of Vatopedi, who very much echoes Saint Paisios' prophecies about Turkey and about those kinds of things, he talks about the closing of the Bosphorus being a sign that some of the things that he talked about happening, and which he calls harsh tribulations, will come to pass. And I think, as COVID started and everything, a lot of more people have kind of been focused on these prophecies. And, Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu is one of the most, I guess, beloved hierarchs around the world right now because of his bravery in the face of the Cypriot government and their persecution and the mandatory vaccinations. But he, of course, is a spiritual son of St. Paisios, St. Porphyrios, and St. Iacovos. And he has already accurately prophesied about the pandemic. He in 2020, in 2019, he made all sorts of very accurate prophecies that ultimately came true, even within certain time frames. And at the same time, though, he himself has made statements that, like, I don't prophesy to be right. Like, I hope that I'm wrong when I say these things. I want to call people to prayer and to call people to repentance. And so when people talk about, like, oh, the Bosphorus Straits are closed, and that's getting us a little bit closer to something that Elder Joseph or St. Paisios or Metropolitan Neophytos have been talking about, what that needs to serve for people, obviously, is, get it together, start praying more, stop sinning, repent, preach the gospel. And that's ultimately the power of prophet. I mean, it's just like in the Old Testament, the message of the prophets, they prophesy about all sorts of geopolitical events and empires, and Ezekiel especially, and Daniel. But what was the message? It was, of course, repentance. It was, of course, returning to true worship.
Yeah, and that's a huge difference, because you see kind of with like Fatima, for example, the Fatimists, they will say things like, oh, consecrate the Reddit heart to Russia. Or things like, it's always these like sensationalist, like seeking types of things. And then you listen to the prophecies in Orthodox, and this is an attitude that, like, there are some Orthodox Christians unfortunately have the sensationalist attitude too, but you listen to their statements and they will always say, yeah, this should move us to repentance, this should move us to prayer. When you're hearing these things, the first thing you should think is not, oh my gosh, Constantinople is going back to us, yay! The first thing that you should think is, these are horrible. We should pray so that actually these wars, these tribulations don't happen, because there's a reason why they're going to happen. It's for our own good, ultimately, in the long term, in the grand sphere. But these are not good things to go through, right? War is not, like World War III is not something that we should be looking for. I mean, I personally, Turkey can have Constantinople all at once. Well, I want it to be Orthodox, but we can make it Orthodox with Turkey, and if Rome became Orthodox in 4 centuries when it was persecuting Christians. So anything can happen. They can have it all they want. Fine, my country, you can take it. But like that's kind of like my attitude to it. But another aspect of these prophecies is that when these kind of, like as you noted, when some of these things that were said happen, we have to start praying more. And with regards to Metropolitan Neophytos, you can look this up on YouTube actually. Metropolitan Neophytos very clearly does indeed say that we're going to enter a new mode of living, right, with relation to the pandemic. And it very clearly does state that it's going to be a virus. They are going to release a virus. I'm not going to get too much into it because YouTube doesn't like it. But, he has statements in that regard. A couple of centuries before, I forgot which saint this was, but this was during the 18th or 19th century, a saint talking about inventions, right? Like, there's going to be like boxes inside people's homes that's going to like show them what's going on in the world, like television, right? There's going to be chariots in the sky, right? Planes, right? And all of these different things that's going to happen, these inventions and these things that's going to happen in the future. So we should be, and the reason why these are obscure relatively, even in the Orthodox world, is because, we don't chase prophecies, but it is also a sign for us to see, where things are going. What is the state of the world? Where are things going? And where are things going with the state of the world in relation to St. Paisios' statements with regards to, Constantine? Is it something that's going to happen soon, or are we entering into like something new that moves to that? Like, what's going on exactly? What would you say?
I don't ever want to say dates. The saints don't say dates,
Exactly.
obviously, I can be dates. But I guess the most specific statement I would say is I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something close to the Third World War or a clash between Russia and Turkey and NATO, and with China even getting involved. I don't think it would be surprising to see that in our lifetime. And that's something that really needs to call people to repentance and prayer, because Elder Joseph, St. Paisios, and Metropolitan Neophytos say that some of these things are going to happen overnight. Like some of these things perhaps might seem ridiculous one day, and then the next day the situation changes, and it's exactly what's happening. And again, God has, of course, the ability to push these things back. His prophets are not going to be offended. And I think generally speaking, we're going to see more and more of these civilizational crashes, because Turkey is one of these civilizational states. Erdogan is, accused by many people of wanting to reinstate the Ottoman Empire. He's making big moves on Greek and Cypriot waters and mineral rights. He's dumping migrants on certain Greek islands. And these are things that were talked about by St. Paisios. There have been economic maritime zones that have been moved that were things that talked about St. Paisios. And of course, we know St. Paisios made some very accurate predictions about, stabbies. And the fact that these things are happening at the similar time and kind of right after the initial big wave of those inoculations came out, I think that is a further vindication that perhaps we should be, heeding these things. And if you're going to get into this stuff, like, this is my job, I keep up with geopolitics, I write articles, like, there's no reason why you shouldn't consult the saints on these things. Like it's a modern mindset that politics is this entirely separated realm. And that's not to say that we idolize it. It's not to say we make it even the primary thing that we talk about. And even then, politics still should even be pointing us to repentance. But it's an industry. It's a job that people do. It's something that we have saints that were very politically involved, and modern saints felt that it was important to talk about these things. And I don't want to say that, we're going to see in 50 years, we're going to see the tripartite split of Turkey between a Christian state, millions of dead, and then, an interior Muslim state. Like, I don't think the saints even meant for us to interpret things happening that exactly. It's more of a roadmap. Mm-hmm. But I do think that we are ultimately going to see a conflict between Russia and Turkey, of course, as the main aggressor there. But part of that has, like, Turkish and Israeli relations with Russia are going to have to deteriorate drastically before that happens, because right now Turkey is still very interested in maintaining a neutral or even friendly relationship with Russia. Turkey itself is in many ways somewhat illiberal, and at least from a governance perspective.
Related, in comparison to Europe, you can say that. But in comparison to Russia, for example, I guess it's closer to Russia in that sense, yeah.
No, I understand it. Turkey is very much secularized, more so like it's moving in a more secularized direction, whereas Russia is somewhat getting more religious. But
Hmm.
Israel right now is seeing like, and also Turkey and Russia are fighting in Syria, which is something that's been happening for a while that has been a strain on relations. And now Russia is doing joint air patrols with Israel, I mean, with Syria near the Israeli border, and that is going to further deteriorate Russian relations with Israel, which in some senses are still somewhat cozy. You know, Putin has his connections. Israel relies a lot on Russian tourism, but this area of the world is it's always been important to the Christian story. You know, I mean, it's the Holy Land. It is, you know, Constantinople. It is, you know, Athens and Greece. And St. Paisios accurately prophesied the invasion of Cyprus by Turkey. And when all this stuff starts to go down, there will be even more dramatic, you know, changes in the world order. And again, we'll never, even when it starts to happen, it might even seem at first like it's never going to turn out that way. And again, it likely will not be exactly as some of these words have said, because God is always listening to our prayers, and our prayers are efficacious, which people forget. Mm-hmm. But I think ultimately we're going to see, as I talked about before and in my article, we're entering a more civilizational age, and some of these civilizations are going to clash. And if the Bible, you know, talks about a lot of things, but one of the things it definitely talks about is these clashes of civilization and how they play into the grand Christian story.
Yeah. And to kind of like get back on the repentance aspect, and I've kind of had to say this over and over again, because one of the biggest problems I see with a lot of people are like obsessed with like end times and prophecies. What's going to happen in the future in geopolitics? This kind of a spirit is not a Christian spirit, first of all. Repentance is primary, because a lot of these things happen, especially if you read scriptures, a lot of these things happen because people aren't repenting, and people can always choose to repent by their own free choice. But if they don't do that, this is what's going to happen, is basically the whole point of a lot of these prophecies or statements from the saints, where it's basically them telling the faithful, look, you know, if you don't pray more, if you don't do good works and show good faith, this world is going to, you know, go in a direction you don't like, right? And
I mean,
I don't like this either.
Right? You know, the churches of Asia Minor, they had their lampstand removed even relatively recently, and there's no reason our churches can't have those same lampstands removed, because, you know, we've been given the gift of the sacraments in the Orthodox Church and the gift of even enlightenment towards the truths of our theology, and to be that aware, have been given those gifts and to have been enlightened that way by God, and to then turn away is a much graver sin than perhaps some of what we might call, you know, heretics, apostates, you know, living their lives.
Yeah. So to kind of get back on the Turkey stuff, from what I've seen in Turkish news personally yesterday, is the general sentiment. Some of the people are kind of saying, well, if you're neutral, then it's going to be good for the economy. Which, you know, so most of you probably know this. Turkish economy is not the best. It is not in the best state right now. But there are some people kind of saying, well, okay, what Russia is doing is kind of concerning. And you talked about, you know, Turkey trying to be neutral. Well, Turkey at the moment is on the U.S. side of things, closer to the U.S. than Russia right now. And that's something, you know, Turkey kind of used the advantage of playing to both sides. But as a matter of fact, in my personal opinion, I think Turkey is the punching bag of both of them. I can show you instances where Turkey kind of, like, for example, a couple of Mavi Marmara. Turks will remember this. Mavi Marmara was a Turkish ship that got attacked by the Israeli armed forces. That caused a huge crisis between Turkey and Israel. Well, what happened? They shook hands, and Israel had nothing. They did nothing. You know, they said, "Oh, sorry," you know, and it was all done. You know, a serious geopolitical force wouldn't just go away with a sorry. Okay. A couple of years ago, I remember this in high school. I believe a Turkish jet was in, I think, Russian airspace, and so it got shut down by Russia. That caused another crisis. Again, what happened? Russia said, "Well, you flew into our airspace, so sorry about your, you know, plane, but you flew into our airspace." And what did Turkey do? You know, okay, you know, we can let that slide. That's kind of just what Turkey's been doing, and especially ever since Trump, with the whole Pastor Branson stuff, Trump has really he's shown an example of how a superpower treats a lesser power economically. He showed, you know what, I'm going to teach you people a lesson. And what happened is that the Turkish currency became incredibly devalued, and so a lot of these things, a lot of the Turkey especially is very key due to its geographical location, etc. And we could talk about the leadership and the civilization, etc., civilization aspect to it. In the present day, Turkey is, I can tell you this very clearly, and Zelensky stated that, oh, we're gonna, have a meeting with these presidents, and Erdogan was one of them. I can tell you this very clearly. The Turkish people are not gonna die for Ukraine. Okay, they're not gonna die for Ukraine. They don't want to die for Ukraine. We're already demoralized. We're already like very down. Our economy is horrible. We don't really have much of a motivation to do things. A lot of people are genuinely suicidal. They don't want to go fight for Ukraine, right? So I think for the time being, Turkey's perspective is that unless this directly threatens our borders, then we're kind of just not interested. And so what Turkey's, we talked about Greece and Cyprus. I think Turkey is going to be, these days, a lot more interested in the Middle East because that's kind of like the only path that they could go. They can't go east. Russia's there. They can't go west. Greece is very, tightly knit with America. And Turkey kind of forced them to do that, right? And we're seeing the negative aspects to it. So I do think Turkey is heavily influencing Greece in that manner. So what's left? South, right? You can't go north. Russia's there. South. So we're going to go south. But there's really not much there either. And there's also Russia there. So for the time being, I think from the Turkish perspective, really from the European perspective, there's really going to be nothing. And this is kind of why I'm saying that nothing's going to come out of it, because Europe in general, they're not really motivated. Again, Germany is not going to die for Ukraine. France is not going to die for Ukraine. England is not going to die for Ukraine. America is not going to die for Ukraine. They don't want to die for Ukraine. So what's going to happen due to this is most definitely just a repetition of the aftermath of Crimea, which is what? Sanctions. Okay. So let's move Russia even closer to China. And so that when China does the same thing with Taiwan, what are you going to do? The same thing. Sanction China. Well, actually, you can't really do that because your economy is dependent on China. And so there's Russia is not that economically powerful, but China is. And the reason why China is powerful is because of the mass population, right? They had the populational strength. And you can see this in Africa right now. I mean, China has been kind of slowly colonizing Africa, but really colonizing these last couple of years. And I don't think Russia's going to mind that. Russia's not going to say, you can't do that. America is definitely going to mind that. I mean, let's not forget, there's a lot of like missionaries, pseudo-missionaries in Africa that are sent by America, that are sent as spies. So America definitely has that interest in Africa. Again, America is losing ground in every regard. This is why, we're saying there's a new age. We're slowly entering a very new age. And this is going to have massive ramifications for politics, especially with the meme virus and all of these things. I mean, politics will not be the same in a couple of years. It really is not going to be the same. A lot of things are going to be different. We don't know exactly how, but a lot of things are going to be genuinely different, I think.
Definitely. And you're completely right. Like, none of these people are going to send people to die for Ukraine. I mean, I think 26% of Americans are interested in getting military involved in Ukraine.
And most of those people don't even know where Ukraine is on the map.
No. And I think I think Turkey, the way it's going to, like, the civilizational nature of Turkey is ultimately going to keep, Erdogan did consolidate some power in that fake coup attempt, slowly but surely he's kind of making some what you might call Putin-esque moves, even though they're kind of bitch made when it comes to Russia and Israel because they have so much economic and energy-based ties. But in the same way that I talked about how Russia is showing they're able to mobilize force and mobilize troops over territory and do strikes, Turkey is one of the powers that can do that as well. They are always moving against the Kurds. They still have deep incursions into Syria. And that's going to be a further strain on the relationship between Russia. And they'll ultimately drive them closer to Israel, though, I feel. And as we know, Turkey has very close relationships with Azerbaijan. In many ways, there's talks of a kind of cultural Belt and Road.
There's a word. There's a saying in Turkey. Bir devlet Bir millet iki devlet. Yeah, one nation, two governments. Like
Yeah,
that's how they see themselves. Well, that's how we
and
see
got
ourselves,
Azerbaijan.
really.
And then you even have Kazakhstan and the other Central European former Soviet republics. Most of them are Turkish ethnically based. And so there's this kind of potential for a big connection, a union of economic and linguistic peoples there. And the growing specter of, Turkish influence, and, they have de jure claims over a lot of areas too, like in the 1900s, and then Ataturk, and before that, when with the Greek Revolution, that they're still an empire, much like Russia, with a lot of its former territory taken away. And as we enter into this stage, those are two powers, and of course, Turkey's tied up in NATO. They've got their treaties. They're obligated to go to war for Estonia just as much as the U.S. is. And so these kinds of, we've seen the stupid treaty things play out in the First World Wars. And of course, that's obviously going to play a part in this. But as of now, nobody's going to do anything. If anything, Turkey might consider, like if they were smart, they might even consider loosening their ties with NATO countries. But I think ultimately this is going to serve to push them closer to Israel, who also has very close relationships with Azerbaijan. I think one of the biggest pipelines in the Middle East is Azerbaijan gas to Israel. And that's, we know, with Nord Stream 2 and with China Belt and Road, like the energy stuff is going to be a big part of this as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we can't really understate the strategic position Turkey itself is in. And you talk about loosening relationship with NATO countries. NATO is not going to accept that. Why? Because Turkey, Turkish military is definitely stronger than the military of most European countries that are in NATO. Like it's one of their best. Turkey is one of the best members of NATO. I mean, that's one of the things and that's kind of like what they want to use as an advantage is that maybe because in the Turkish mindset, especially kind of like the geopolitical mindset, they kind of want to just if we have more control over the Middle East, if we can expand it just a little bit more, we'll be taken more seriously and we'll have more natural resources, and then we can solve all of these problems that we have in the country. But a lot of them forget at the same time, Turkey actually used to be a very good country in the 2010s. A lot of people are looking, 12 years ago, 15 years ago with nostalgia, whether it's in the organizations, right? There were many Turkish organizations, sports clubs or whatever. They were considered to be like the highest valued organizations. Turkish economy was certainly in a very good shape. I mean, even in 2014, $1 was 2 Turkish liras. You want to know what $1 in Turkish liras is right now? Like 13, 14 Turkish liras. So there's a huge, there's a very sudden shift. And that does factor into the decision making of not only Turkey, but also America and Russia. Like how much military strength does Turkey actually even have anymore? Because, the currency devaluation does, in fact, if you want to import weapons, it's going to be much more difficult, right? We see this in like the financial groups as well. A lot of the financial groups here, they can't really cope with this. I mean, they have already a lot of debt. They can't really cope with this. But to kind of like go back to Ukraine and Russia is that kind of the same, how should I say, problems are there. But what Russia did, which is what Turkey did not do, because Turkey is dependent on the US dollar. Because really, again, in many ways, Turkey is a American, nation state. Russia, for example, invested more in gold, right? So they're investing in commodities more. They want to move away from the petrodollar to something different to kind of become more financially independent. And so these sanctions, it's very interesting because they did this recently, a couple months ago, and then they did this, and it's as if they know that the sanctions are going to happen, which anyone can see that. And they're kind of already preparing themselves. Okay, if the sanctions are going to hit, what can we do before to kind of like reduce the strain? Invest in gold, right? Invest in these different currencies, or maybe, becoming more sympathetic with cryptocurrency. I mean, Russia is starting to...
Today, Russia said they're going to be expanding their crypto portfolio and, really making it easier to make transactions because, I mean, they even anticipate getting removed from SWIFT, which Americans are like afraid to do, but they're anticipating it already. So they're really preparing for, they're preparing to have their own global parallel economy. And why did the Iraq war ultimately start? Well, Saddam Hussein was trying to buy oil from Iran not in dollars, right? So what happens when, one thing if it's Iraq and, a desert land, but like if you've got Russia and China trying to buy oil and power and energy from Iran with their currency or with even maybe a digital currency, that's going to be more of a casus belli for war, but the Americans might not know what to do.
Exactly. And with and another thing with kind of like the energy resource as well. Another reason why, it's not really smart to kind of just like stomp on Russia's feet is that they do have a lot of connections to, natural energy resources that the West does need. I mean, gas prices going through the roof right now. If you haven't noticed, a lot of these commodities going through the roof right now while the markets are going down. This again, it's very geopolitical, and this is kind of why I mentioned, before, the 3-4 months ago, starting 3-4 months ago, global markets have been collapsing. Like they have been not collapsing. It's a very hard word. It's a very harsh word, but they've been going down. There's a downtrend. There's a very clear downtrend. It's going on a little bit of a corrective phase in anticipation of that. So in terms of like, I think even financial markets, I will say, and this has kind of like been beneficial for me. This isn't even like a way to make money. This is to kind of follow where we're going with trajectory. I think if financial markets start to recover, it's probably a good sign that means that the big boys are ready to, they don't have any more plans. They're ready to kind of just let things, right? And, Russia's going to want that, for example. America is also going to want that. They're going to want to let things, let's let things go peaceful for a couple months, maybe even a year or two. And let's just forget that this happened. That's what Russia's going to want. That's what happened with Crimea. No one remembers Crimea anymore. No one is like, they're all like, oh yeah, Crimea, yeah, Russia has it, I guess. That's what they think now. In 5 years, it might be the same thing. And so, but these things take time. And I think that's kind of what, that we're kind of going to be entering into that phase as soon as, Russia gets what it wants. And I do think as long as Russia gets what it wants, because Ukraine is a poor country. It doesn't have financial resources. It doesn't have, as a weak military. I mean, look, it's losing to independence groups. The military is losing to independence groups. It's not a good sign. Okay, it's like American tier stuff, right? So I think that's like me personally. Again, this is not a prediction. It's kind of just like what I think is going to happen in the long term in the future. Is that things are going to calm down eventually. Russia's going to get what they want, and in fact, I think while during the stream, I believe Ukrainian President Zelensky said that Ukraine is ready to discuss neutrality. So Ukraine is starting to get ready to discuss neutrality, even.
Yeah, Zelensky, I saw that while we were streaming. Zelensky made a statement about, he said something about neutrality, about barring NATO membership, but then he's like, well, we need our guarantees. So he's clearly looking for a backdoor. He recognizes there's a good chance that he gets totally thrown out. And I don't think he has any interest of being like the feminist meme government in exile of Belarus that literally no one takes seriously. I think he sees that in his future and doesn't fancy living in an apartment in Warsaw for the rest of his life. And I think because of that, he might be willing. And there was even talk that because Zelensky was so, like the U.S. were the ones pushing for him to do stuff over there, and he was much more, some say that he's even been planning for a backdoor to save face, both with his people and not look like he just got steamrolled, but at the same time have a backdoor to still concede to the Russians. But he talked about how, these financial markets and some of what it means for the future of this new age, I guess, that we're entering into. And you talked about Africa. And all the players that we're talking about here, they're the ones that are involved in Africa. And even some that I mentioned earlier, like in Africa, you've got America, France, Russia, China, and then a little bit of Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is heavily involved in the current civil war and regime fight in Libya, which Russia is heavily involved in. That's basically a Russian-Turkish proxy war. And then you have a bunch of French-Russian proxy war going on, Ali, Burkina Faso. Those are all coups supported by Russia. And then, of course, you have U.S.-aligned states in Western Europe. And then, of course, you talked about China coming in and taking over all of these things, which everyone knows about, the Belt and Road, and China taking over Africa. And I think one of the big differences between now and the annexation of Crimea, of course, is the meme virus. And the meme virus really kind of set the stage for all these conflicts to be kind of held in the context of the specter of global one world government, World Economic Forum kind of stuff that is always looming. And I think they're, of course, going to use these outbreaks of what you might call civilizational based violence, warfare, multipolarity. They're going to use that as a scare tactic, I think. And I think there's also a chance of a dialectic occurring between China and then the liberal model of the World Economic Forum, which I think could be synthesized into something pretty terrifying.
Yes,
actually.
exactly. I was gonna say, cyber polygon is one of those kind of like cyber pandemic, right? If there's so if there's a world of different factions, a cyber polygon seems, these people will eat it up. These people will say, oh, maybe Russia did this, right? With the kind of like, again, I mean, a couple of years ago in American elections, they were saying things like how Putin was controlling US elections and all of this kind of stuff, So they kind of already preparing the people to have that kind of a mindset. And now with cyber polygon, I think definitely there's going to be, China involvement, Russian involvement, they're going to frame these countries, right? World Economic Forum is going to, because really, World Economic Forum officially says, well, these are drills, right? These are drills for us to prepare if something like this happens. But what it really means is that we are drilling to make this happen so that we can make you think who did it, right? That's basically what it means. It's the same thing with Operation Lockstep. If you know the document by Rockefeller Institution, where they're talking about, well, what should we do if there is a little itsy bitsy particle stuff that causes us to a lot. What should we do? PCR test, that's already talked about there. This is in 2010, by the way. These plannings, these drills are really, they're just, they're about, what are we going to do to you? That's basically what it means. And so they need to be looked at from that perspective as well.
Alex Jones in October, Alex Jones said late February war. And he said that based on his analysis of NATO documents, World Economic Forum stuff, and then some insiders. And I think that a lot of this stuff is planned. And you talk about cyber polygon, the future of cyber warfare. I mean, the U.S. has been, with rolling blackouts in California. I'm from Texas. We did the whole big freeze thing last year. My city lost water this year for 4 years. All of this steady decline of infrastructure, and a lot of the justifications are cyber attacks. Like, they're definitely preparing you for a false flag psyop cyber attack.
Exactly.
And that's going to be a huge aspect of all of this. And I think another thing we have to, you brought this up a little bit, with the idea of Russians being blamed and the hostility towards perhaps the Russian Orthodox Church. When you talked about the fear mongering about Russia stealing our election, that was really one of a big flashpoint of the decline in Russia-American relations. And what we know, someone that we love very much, Abbot Trifon, was a victim of violence because of that. Someone saw him at a gas station filling up his car and punched him in the face multiple times because they knew somehow that he was affiliated with the Russian church.
Yes.
And for us to act like those things might not happen, that's not to say that we go crazy and get paranoid. And I think ROCOR churches are being careful enough after the whole Sarah Riccardi Swartz nonsense. But just be careful, just make sure that, you're not, making yourself a target or anything like that. I think God will protect us and everything will be fine. But, as these civilizational struggles increase, there's going to be demonization.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we should be preparing ourselves for sure. I've also seen Secretary Blinken tells ABC tonight that he's convinced President Putin is going to try to overthrow the Ukrainian government and attempt to reconstitute the Soviet Empire. This is the stuff that America comes up with, and people eat this up. People actually believe this nonsense. It's going to be Soviet Empire, bro. Russia does not want the Soviet Empire. There's no reason to go back to a Soviet Empire. It's outlived its purpose. You know what happened with the Soviet Empire? Russia lost a lot of territory. That's what happened with the Soviet Empire. There's no need to go back to the same failed thing that didn't work, right? And Russia transitioned from being a Soviet power to, it's kind of transitioning into a new identity in this age. Whatever that is, some people speculate Orthodox Empire. I don't think that's going to happen. That's way too optimistic. But maybe a more of a Russian state or a Russian Federation, an actual one, right, that identifies itself and has has a proper, how should I say, culture that manifests itself in the new world. I think it's kind of what it's looking for.
Definitely. We need to not fall for any of the memes about like Ukraine being dragged back in time into a Soviet sphere of influence. I mean, look, the 90s raped Russia. They raped Ukraine even worse than Russia. Ukraine is where drugs come in from Kosovo. Ukraine is the hub of human trafficking in Europe. Ukraine has GDP per capita like exponential, like noticeably lower than Moldova. Like, this is a country that has done nothing but suffer under neoliberal capitalism. And this idea that it coming back into the Russian sphere of influence will be, you know, taking them back to the Stone Age is just ridiculous. And the Soviet rhetoric is just to rile up boomers. Blinken knows that, you know, he's already in a party that historically was anti-war. They're becoming much more hawkish because of their marriage to human rights and neoliberal democracy. But they want as best as they can to get the dumb boomers, the neocons, the boomer cons, just back on their beat, you know, unthinkingly supporting anti-Russian military action. And that's what the Soviet language does. And I mean, like right now, even in France, 70% of the French population are against military intervention. And I think I talked about in my article and maybe a bit earlier how both the right-wing candidates, Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen, have expressed that they will leave NATO if elected president in the upcoming election against Macron. And so I think there's a real possibility that NATO stops existing in the next 10 years. That's another thing we have to talk about, because if France leaves, that of course leaves the three big boys still, UK, Turkey, and America. But if Trump gets back in, perhaps America might be looking at looking at its negotiations. Italy has a right-wing movement growing that would also consider looking at the possibility of leaving. And while it looks like the US is going to try to expand into Scandinavia here, with Finland reconsidering their membership, I think that's really going to like die attempt to grow, and then I think they're probably going to start shrinking.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me, because if you remember in 2015, one of the arguments in 2016, one of the arguments Trump made is that the NATO countries need to pay their fair share. And I think that kind of like push also incentivized a lot of the people in Europe to say, we don't want to pay for military expenses. What are you forcing us to pay for military? That's the whole point of being in NATO, is that we don't have to pay for this stuff. And you're telling us to pay for this stuff? Why would we be in NATO then? And it's kind of just, I think that's kind of, I don't know if it's deliberate. I don't know if it isn't. You know, like we can theorize about the intentions behind it. But what it has done definitely is that it made Europeans think, you know, this NATO stuff might not be good for us. I mean, it's already negatives. It's already kind of restricting our freedom. And this is kind of like the rhetoric of the right-wingers in Europe, is the freedom aspect to it. They want freedom. They want self-determination. They don't want to be puppets of the American government. And so even amongst the American party, the Western party, there's a very, you know, clear disunity there, right? Whereas, you know, in the East, right, with China, Russia, and other places, they are trying to make things more unified and squashing the opposition that is near to them, right? And the opposition is, you know, is due to American influence. So I think that that's also something to look out for as well. I mean, NATO not existing in 10 years, I find that very difficult. The reason why is, especially there's going to be a lot of people now that's going to be like, we need NATO, right? If it weren't for NATO, these people will create. This is kind of the reason why that rhetoric even exists in the first place. It's a stupid rhetoric. But why does it exist? Well, if they didn't make that rhetoric, then people will think, well, why are we in NATO, right? But if people are fearful of a potential, you know, Russian expansion to the West, then suddenly NATO becomes necessary in these people's minds. So there is kind of that, you know, Europeans are just not sure. They're unsure about what they want to do. They're not really certain about what they want to have. Do we want freedom, or do we want security and protection from Russia? What do we want? And even, you know, the people who have a good idea about Russia, even they will be a lot more fearful. You know, they will be like, their rhetoric against NATO is definitely going to be weaker, I think. That's kind of what I think. That's why I think Russia wants to end this swiftly as possible. That's why World War III, probably not going to happen. If you want it to happen, probably not going to happen. Russia wants to end this as soon as possible. America wants this to end as soon as possible. Ukraine wants to prolong this. UK, they want to prolong this to like weaken Russia, but the writing's on the wall. I mean, Russia is gonna, win, whether you like that or not. Russia is going to want its demands met, whether you like it or not, and Russia is going to want this to lay down and just like ride the calmness until until a certain point in time, or unless America tries to do something, right? Which I don't think they want to do, because I don't think America can really do anything. That's why, like, the kind of like the Russian army propaganda versus American army propaganda. There's a huge difference between the Russian people are like ready, right? They're ready if something happens. American military, they're like, yay, haha, let's have fun with our diversity and our strength. That's kind of like America is still decadent. They're not, and decadence is complacency. Complacency means you think you're winning. So the mindset is very different in that regard as well, from like the two geopolitical sides.
No, I think you're right that like right now we're gonna see, I think what I would call it honestly like a dead cat bounce, like it's hitting the ground and coming back up a little bit. And I think we'll see that in Scandinavian expansion. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw Swedish or Finnish NATO membership the next few years. But then I think that is going to precipitate its downfall as well, because the biggest argument against America being in NATO is like, okay, so we have treaties now that make us go to war with these Baltic countries or with these other countries that we don't care about. And if you're France or Italy or even Germany at a certain point, it's like, look, if maybe Russia is going to make a move on parts of Finland, or if they're going to make a move on Estonia, or if they're going to make a move somewhere else where NATO expands its sphere of influence, do we want to go to war for them? And that's eventually going to lead to bigger national conversations about entangling treaties and these alliances that get people into conflicts that aren't in their national interest. And I think we also just have to watch how Germany takes Nord Stream 2. If Germany reneges America's request and reopens the pipeline, because look, they don't have that much gas. Gas prices are going to go up. People are going to get discontent. If that opens up, I think that's going to say a lot. Like, we already know we're in this new order. I think World War III isn't going to happen anytime soon, but I think we are now, the stage has been set for perhaps a future and an era where something like that could be feasible. And I think that's where we're entering right now.
Yes, and I think with that, unless there's something I'm missing, I think we can conclude with that. I think it's been a little less than 2 hours so far, but I think this was great. I think we had more than 100 viewers like throughout the whole stream, which is great. A lot of people seem to have liked this from the live chat, from the likes, etc. And I think we can have more conversations, geopolitical conversations that are targeted about different countries as well in the future. I mean, I'd love to have you on again if you want to, of course.
Yeah, and I love your show. I love the channel. You're a homie, obviously. I think we could have more great conversations. I'm trying to expand more content in my job and my work, so I think this could be good.
Yeah, certainly. And although as I said, my whole thing is theology and all this kind of stuff, I do think it actually has some sort of relevance to a lot of the world events right now, and there's a time and place for everything. And this is kind of why I kind of feel strange, because there's a lot of good video ideas I have, but it's like, this is not the time and place, so I think we kind of have to be look at what's happening in the world. But yeah, thank you, man. This was a great stream. I hope everyone watching this enjoyed it. I think this was great, and more will come for sure, unless some people have a different idea. Hello, YouTube. Though I think we were nice. I think we were nice enough, acceptable enough for them. Yeah, we behaved quite well, and we don't have any problems or any issues with behaving well. But I would like to, I think we can conclude here. Thank you all for watching this. Definitely more, geopolitical streams like this. This was really interesting and very fun. I mean, it's kind of rekindling my political energy that kind of just was lost ever since 2017. After 2017, 2018, I kind of just stopped caring about politics. But this was quite fun. I do think things are getting more interesting now. Actual things are happening, so it's getting more interesting, because until recently, I mean, politics was kind of just like, this guy said that and this guy said this. okay, cool, right? It's like nothing changed, nothing happened, everything's still crappy. But now it's as if, you know, something real is happening. It's really interesting to see how it goes. So we'll leave it for the time being. Again, as I said before, the donations are going to be half and half for the super chats. And right before we leave, we got a $20 super chat by Golden Arm. Thank you. He says, great job. Hopefully I didn't miss another super chat, but let's see. Yes, it seems like these are all. So just AOC's Abuela, £2 donation, said, Jay Dyer and Steve Turley live stream Ven. That will be interesting, actually.
I'm trying to make it real.
You're trying to make what?
I'm trying to make that real.
Yeah, let's make it real. And we're going to conclude the stream here. Thank you all for watching. I will see all of you in the next stream or video.